So let's take a look at WISP. This is the landing page or the introductory page for WISP. And you'll see down here at the bottom the URL wisp.cals.wisc.edu is where you can find the model. There's also a user guide that is available for download on the list over here on the left. And that's also a handy reference. So here's the WISP landing page. And as you can see, I have put farm number 1, demo farm, into the model already. And to add a new farm, there's a button right down below that you simply press to add a new farm. It's a relatively simple process. Now you'll notice that down below here, we have this fields or number of fields that are below allowable depletion. So these fields where the allowable depletion water has been removed are beginning to experience plant stress. And the model flags those fields in this list right here on the front farm page, so you can see those quickly and easily. Front page here is the account manager, and you can see that it will allow you to edit your email, your password, and you can even cancel your account if you like. Okay? And then of course you also have an option here where you can sign out. But as the note down here, the reminder says, remember that as of February 15th, WISP will reset and zero out all of the user inputs. But there is a feature that we'll talk about when we get to a little farther down in the model here, where you can save all of your results in a CSV file or comma-separated variable file that you can easily read into Excel. So you can always save all of your inputs and outputs and calculations from any given year. Okay, so to enter information into WISP, we're going to start going down this list here, and we're going to start with the pivots, fields, and crops screen. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say I want to add a new pivot. All right, so you can go up here and you'll have to backspace in order to eliminate what's in there. And we're going to call this one pivot number 2. Okay, and then you need to give it a latitude and longitude, because it will use that information to get the site-specific ET values for that site, for that particular pivot. So you want to make sure that you enter these to 1 point to the right of the decimal. And for longitude, it is important that you enter a negative, because we're in the Western Hemisphere, value for that. Okay, and then you can also enter, these are for informational purposes, pump capacity, the energy type, whether you have electric, diesel, and so on and so forth, and then notes. But the critical thing to remember when you're entering information into WISP, you can enter that full line, but in order for it to be recorded, you must hit, and I'll repeat, you must hit return. Okay, so now we have pivot number 2 entered, and we're down here and we're going to have the opportunity to enter a field or fields for pivot number 2. And in doing so, we have 2 options. Down at the bottom here, you can add a field and use the percent cover that you as a user put in for the crop each week or so, and that will adjust the potential ETs appropriately. The other option here uses more or less a generic crop growth curve where you don't need to put in the percent covers. But I recommend using the percent cover input for crops, because it's going to be more robust and take into account a greater number of crop types. So to enter our field for our pivot number 2, we simply backspace and we enter whatever name we want to use for that particular pivot. So we say pivot 2, I'm just going to call it field 1. All right. And then again, this is informational. It's not used in the model. It's more for record keeping, the area of that field. And then you can also select your majority soil type. And what this does by selecting different soil type values is it adjusts the field capacity and permanent wilt point of the soils in that field. So You can also use the web soil survey to get this information, but the model does have these default values that you can use if you wish, or you don't want to use this web soil survey. So now that I've entered this information in, again, you remember you must hit return to get that information recorded in the model. All right, now we're ready to put in a crop. So we come down here to the first field, or first input point, and we put in the name that we want for our crop. So I'll call it crop number 1. And then there's another drop down here that has several different types of crops in it. And what this drop down does is it allows you to, if you select based on your crop, it will adjust the managed root zone depth down here. All right. So whatever crop you want to select, you can see that the root zone depth will change accordingly. Okay, so we'll put potatoes in there. And then variety, this is again informational. So whatever variety, just for your information, that you want to have in there, you can enter that at that point. And then, of course, you've got a harvest kill date in here that when you terminate that crop, you can put that date in there, and that will shut off the evapotranspiration. And over here, of course, we have the root zone depths. So again, enter return to record that field information. And now our field has been recorded in WISP. And that structure that you put in will stay. It'll be zeroed out every year in this next screen, which is called the field status screen. And that screen is the screen that you'll probably use the most because it contains the daily information that you will use for your crop input and water management. So up on the top here, we have drop downs where you can select your farm and your pivot. I'm going to select pivot number 1 because it has some things here I would like to illustrate. And then you can also select the field, and there's a date range as well over here that can be selected. So this is, like I say, this is probably the screen that you'll use most. There's a great deal of information on here about the crop type and about the farm and the pivot, the root zone depth, the field capacity, and so on and so forth. We also have a value over here on the left called target. And what target is that's for what's called a partial irrigation strategy. If you're going to irrigate not all the way up to field capacity, but some fraction of field capacity, you can enter that fraction here. So in this case, I've entered 70. So if we look at the graph down below here, you can see that field capacity is shown by this top gray line. This green line here represents 70% of field capacity. The red line here represents the point at which the allowable depletion has been exceeded, or where the allowable depletion is. And when you drop below, water levels drop below that line, plants begin to experience stress. Okay? So the idea behind using a partial irrigation strategy is that by not filling the profile completely up to field capacity, you're allowing some additional water there that can be used to store space, that can be used to store rainwater, and hopefully you can take better advantage of that rainwater. Now, field experience at the Hancock Station has shown that for field corn, soybeans, those types of crops, 70% seems to work pretty well for a target. However, for potatoes and vegetables, they recommend 80 or above. So just something to keep in mind when you're setting the model up. So we have a lot of information on the page, and I'll go through the information on the page one row or one column at a time. The far left column, we have the date. Next to that, we have the potential ET. That's the amount, maximum amount of evapotranspiration that can occur based on the temperature and relative humidity conditions. So that number has to be adjusted, and we'll see in a few minutes that we can adjust that using the canopy cover. Rainfall, pretty straightforward, just inches of rainfall that occur. It's good to have a gauge in each field if you can. Several gauges are better. Irrigation, again, keeping track of how much irrigation water you put on. You're adding that. These, again, you can think of as deposits for the checkbook method. Percent soil moisture. Okay, that's the percentage of the soil moisture that's in the root zone. So this is why I advise that you get a probe, a soil moisture probe, and you can use that soil moisture probe to monitor the soil moisture and get a real idea or real world validation of what the model is telling you. So this value will allow you, you can put in your observed soil moisture, and the model will use that observed soil moisture from that point forward. So this allows you to ground truth the model and make sure that it's giving you good information, because over time the variability in these different inputs can add up and start to create problems as far as tracking your soil moisture. And then percent cover over here, this is again and if you look in the irrigation management guide that I showed you earlier for irrigation water management, there's a diagram in there that explains how to calculate this. But there's also an app that you can get for your phone called Canopio that will allow you to take a picture of the cover and it'll calculate the percent cover for you. But the idea here is that you put in the percent cover, that number is applied to the potential ET to get an adjusted ET. And so that's adjusted ET is the value that's used and displayed for your management purposes. And once you get to 80% canopy cover, then it's using the full potential ET. So anything above 80%, you can go ahead and put 100 in if you'd like when you get to full canopy cover, but anything above 80, it's going to use the full canopy cover. Okay, so now if we look down here, we have a time series graph right below that table. This time series graph is real handy because we're starting up here just a little bit below field capacity, and we can see that as the growing season goes on, water starts to come out of this soil profile. We get down and we deplete the allowable depletion, and we start to get into this zone below the red line. So we are actually down below where the allowable depletion is, and the plant is starting to experience water stress. Now you can go a little bit below this line and then irrigate back up and not have a problem. But if you get too far below this line, number one, you may not be able to catch up again with your irrigation system, and number two, your plant may be stressed too excessively. So the times to avoid plant water stress specifically and most importantly is during the reproductive stage. So whenever that plant's in the reproductive stage, you want to make sure that you've got plenty of water out there, and you want to keep it right up near the field capacity value. So now what happens here is I've put a rather large rainstorm in here, and you can see that the soil water value jumps all the way back up to field capacity, but it's even more than the amount of water that came in that rainfall event is even more than the soil can hold. So you're exceeding field capacity. And if you look over here on the right side, you will see in red lettering the amount of water that exceeded the field capacity of the soil. This is the volume of water that's deep draining or leaching down below the root zone, and therefore has the potential to carry nutrients and pesticides down into groundwater. So that's why we have this flagged with rather large lettering here, so that you pay attention to that. You'll also notice that when you drop below the allowable depletion in the graph here in the field status page, that this turns red. So it's trying to warn you that you are below field capacity and could have some potential problems there. Now you'll also notice here that there are a couple of points on the graph that have hashed lines across them. Those points are projected ET. So what the model does is it goes back and it uses the previous week's worth of data, averages the ET, and then as you'll see down below here on the lower left side, it applies a projected allowable depletion. So it gives you kind of an idea, assuming that the ET stays the same, what your water content might be a couple days, 2 to 3 days out. Okay. The other thing that the field screen contains is the seasonal totals, and this is really handy. It keeps track of the total rainfall up to that point. It keeps track of the total irrigation, the total ET, and the total drainage. So you have a complete record there of the amount of water going into the soil profile and the amount of water coming out of the soil profile. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this feature called Create Report in CSV format, and that's right here within the seasonal totals box. This report is essentially this table up here and everything that's in it. So it allows you, and the totals, it also includes the totals for each of those columns. So this can be your permanent record. You can keep this and make sure you do it before February 15th, and you'll still have it there. You can do it anytime over the winter, and that's your record of what your irrigation water use was, your rainfall, and your soil water status. Okay? So the next feature that the model offers is something called field groups. All right, and so you can take in for multi-edit purposes only, and this allows you, if you have several fields that are getting the same amount of irrigation or receiving the same amount of rainfall, you can go in and you can add all of that information to all of those fields simultaneously. But the model needs to know which fields you want to add that information to. So the first thing it's going to ask you for is a group name. So we're going to call this one group number 2. Location again is optional. Whatever means, what has the most meaning to you and is the most valuable to you. And then any notes that you might have about that field group. So then you can come over here and you can select fields. You'll have a whole list here of all of the fields that you've created in WISP. And you can go ahead and you can add one, or if you want, you can add all, however you choose to do it. And you can also remove fields from that list. Okay? So once you've set up your group, you're good to go, and you're able to do multi-edit functions. Okay? All right, and this brings up the multi-edit screen. And again here, you have a choice. You can pick your group, and you can go in and you can add a value. Say you got a ½ inch of rainfall. You can go ahead and add that in for a given day. If you had, say, a little bit of irrigation, you can also add that. Let's put that on a different day, but remember that you must hit return for that in order for that to be recorded. All right, then you can come down here and you can say, all right, I put on a ½ inch of irrigation the next day. Okay, and then that information gets copied to the fields that you previously selected to be within that field group. So that allows you to basically edit multiple fields at the same time. So this really concludes the information that I had prepared on the WISP model. This is basic functionality. Certainly you're welcome to try the user guide and try some different things yourself. And we'll head back to the slides and we'll finish up. You can get the WISP model at the wisp.cals.wisc.edu URL is where you will find it. And again, once again, I said the user guide is right there. You can download that at any time. And that concludes my discussion today on how to set up and operate the WISP model. Thank you for your time and attention.